Welcome or welcome back to Trail and Ultra Running Training. My name is Will France. I'm a personal trainer, running coach, strength coach, whatever else. The whole goal of this podcast is to provide some free information so you can run better and run longer, stay safer, and just have more fun outside. It's the whole reason we do all these things. If you like the information, I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe. Apparently, that's the best metric we can give the algorithm overlords to share this podcast, but even like leaving a rating or review or sharing it with someone else would be super helpful. If you have a minute to do that, I'd really appreciate it. Anyway, let's talk about this idea of graded exposure, which I realize it's not a big buzzword, but it does really matter because it's a lot of how we think of like the entire rehab space in physical fitness work, whatever. When we think about graded exposure, it's this like therapy concept that is applied. We've often probably heard of exposure therapy when we think of like cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is the same kind of idea when we look at how rehab works. So exposure therapy in cognitive behavioral therapy is like, say you're afraid of snakes. First, you need to be in a safe space, and you might look at like you might talk about snakes and then look at a picture of a snake, and then ultimately you might end up many steps down the line, like holding a safe snake, right? And one of the things that people mess up when they talk about exposure therapy is they go from like step 1 to step 20. They don't do the picture of a snake first. They just like, well, I'm afraid of snakes. I'm going to do exposure therapy, so I'm going to like be around snakes. And that is not how that works. You're supposed to ease up. Anyway, so when we look at physical realm, same kind of idea. This is how a lot of our rehab concepts are built. So if you are running and you get hurt running, and let's use IT band syndrome because it's come up a couple times in the past week for me and people I work with. And it's a pretty easy demo for how this might work, right? So if we have some IT band syndrome and you're running, say, 30 miles a week, and you weren't having anything at like 20 or 25 miles a week, and then you up to 30, and then you started having some like that outer knee pain, right? Like outside and below your kneecap, your patella, very textbook IT band friction syndrome. And so we had that at 30, but we didn't have it at 25. So we went back down to 25 miles a week and slowly build up. And this would be the idea of graded exposure. And if we do this well, we might also add some other things in. Now, graded exposure is great. It's basically how we should elevate running volume anyway, right? Like this is often why we get injured going from 15 miles a week to 30, because doubling your running volume in the span of a week isn't a great thing to do because you're probably going to get hurt because your body isn't ready to deal with it unless you have a long running background and tendons of steel, right? The rest of us, easing into it, adding maybe 10 to 20% a week is a good idea. And if you go like are doing well and you hit a spot where you're not doing well, backing off to the last place where you were doing well and easing up slower can be really helpful. It can work. Downside is it can also take a long time. So theoretically, jumping from 25 miles one week to 30 the next week is not that unreasonable as long as it was spaced out appropriately. As long as like that 5 mile increase didn't come from only your long run. Let's say like you jump from a 10-mile long run to a 15. It's also a 50% increase. We need to kind of look at this on the day as well. Pretty significant 50% increases. It's not like you went from 1 to 2 miles, you went from 10 to 15. So if that's not where the entirety of that 5 miles comes from, then it should be pretty reasonable, right? Like that could be an extra little mile a day for 5 days out of the week. And we should be able to handle that. It's more aggressive than the 10% rule. So it's not like the safest thing in the world if we're being incredibly controlled, but it's about 20%. It's on the upper end of reasonable. And again, if it's spread out through the week, you should be able to do that. So if we can't do that, there's probably something going on. And it probably has to do with movement patterning, right? Like one of the things that we know causes IT band friction syndrome, at least we think, I don't know if we know anything about the human body, but that we think causes IT band friction syndrome is when you run, your knee caves a little bit. And it's usually caves because we don't have great hip abduction, right? Your glute med isn't doing its thing super well. You're relying entirely on your piriformis for lateral hip stability. And we just have this like subtle knee cave every step. And when it doesn't have to be much, right? Like your knees don't have to go in like you're doing some limbo dance move from the disco era. It can just be this like slight centimeter shift with every step of a run. Because if you run for miles, like it's going to be thousands and thousands of steps. So over time, you're just going to get more and more of that friction problem, right? So if we have this friction issue over time, it's going to result in pain. Now, we can back off and just do this graded exposure where we come back to the safest point and maybe add 1 mile the next week, then a mile the following week. And by the time you get back up to 30, you'll probably desensitized your body to enough or like figured out a way to do it that you will be safe at 30 miles a week. But we can also add some like specific variability. Because instead of taking multiple weeks to get there, we could take a couple weeks to get there and add like strength work would be a really good example. There's a few ways to do this, right? But this is the entire concept of physical therapy, where we grade you down to where you can handle, and then we add some exercises to basically make muscles do what they're supposed to do. And this is why banded two blocks, where you put one of these bands around your knee area and shuffle side to side, helps at all for IT band syndrome. Because I mean, this is a rubber band. It's not going to build strength really in the glutes of a person running up mountains, but they can remind those muscles that they exist and be a really useful warm-up before you go out for a run, right? So I find something like a banded two block, where again, you put this around your knees and you shuffle back and forth. You'll feel the side of your hip. And then if you do that before you go out running, you'll probably use it better. So that can be really helpful. But we also want to make it stronger because probably an actual strength deficiency there. And if we're going to do that, probably need to load it heavier because a rubber band probably isn't strong enough to make you stronger if you run up mountains or down mountains or for distances really at all. So for that, something like a sumo deadlift is really good. So we come down, pick something heavy off the ground. We put our toes out at like 45 degrees. Your knees would be out in line with our toes. Push your hips back until your weight's in your heels. Try to keep your shin vertical. And then pick like a heavy kettlebell up and squeeze your butt. We should feel a lot of core stability. Should get some drive in the glutes. And at the top, should find that squeeze in the glute med. And by keeping your knees out in line with your toes, now it doesn't need to be super wide. You don't need to be in a split. We want to just be wide enough that we can really forcibly create that hip abduction, pushing the knees out. And you pick up something heavy while you're in that position, your glute med really has to do its job, and it will get stronger. And after a few weeks of that, you can probably make your IT band syndrome a lot better. And if we pair all these things together, you, instead of increasing your running ceiling, as it were, at like 30 miles, we've probably pushed it to like 40 with a lot less frustration. Because not only have we done some graded exposure on the running, where we backed off to the last safe space and then rebuilt up to a new volume, We've also made the muscles stronger from some specific variability. Specific variability is this idea of like other training that's helpful, cross training, strength training, all these things that help you get better at the activity you're doing. This is very different from, well, it's not very different, but it's like foundationally different from just random workouts that we do, right? Like they should be applicable. You can't just go do bench press and expect it to help your IT band syndrome. Not a bad thing to do to make you stronger down the line, which is a good thing. But we should apply some workouts and exercises and movements that will help you deal with the injury, get stronger so that it doesn't come back while we go through this graded running exposure. So if we hit it from these like 3 directions, from a like grade to running exposure, and then do some of the light bandy kind of work to remind the muscle that exists as a warm-up. This is why we should, have some kind of warm-up relevant to you and where you are right now in your training. If you're struggling with some IT band stuff, then some banded tube walks might be a really good idea. We can't find glute activation, then you might do some hip bridges. If you really struggle to keep your pelvis flat, then we might do some like cat-cow with a big focus on pelvic tilt, right? Like a warm-up is useful, but it's only as useful as it applies to you. So having some idea of where you struggle with running and then taking 30 seconds to do a couple movements that will remind certain muscles that they need to play along and like come to the party is a really great idea. And so we use that in our warm-up and then do a little bit of strength training to actually make the relevant muscle stronger so that we can reduce the risk for injury down the line. And this not only can help you progress faster. I mean, if you have an injury or you're having real big struggles with your IT band, you might end up back at 30 miles at about the same time. But again, you've increased your ceiling to like 40. So now we don't have to go through this whole process every 5 miles. We're not like hopscotching up to, oh, I'm injured again. Let's do this again. Oh, I'm injured again. Let's do this again. It's just making your capacity better and bigger so that we can keep doing this thing that we really enjoy without getting hurt. Anyway, I hope this was helpful, explaining kind of rehab ideas and why we might use certain protocols or why other forms of training might be really applicable. And if you have any questions, please shoot me a message. That's what I'm here. Thanks for sticking around and listening to talk about running and training. I really appreciate it. That's all. Hope you have a great rest of your day and go have fun training.